Episode 8 of the series of videos I'm making covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't seen the previous videos, I'd recommend going to the hashtag HisTV YouTube channel and having a look at those first, particularly the videos I've made on America during the 1920s, the economic boom, the 1930s looking at the Great Depression, and then the impact of World War II on American society, which was episode 7. Today we're going to have a look at America during the post-war era in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And we're going to try and answer the question, what were the key features of American society after World War II? For those of you that have studied this at home or in school or have watched my previous video, you'll know that World War II really was the end of America's experience of the Great Depression and the beginning of America's proper recovery from that period. So we're going to have a look at the growing prosperity, particularly for white middle-class Americans, but then also look at the darker side of this period through something called the Red Scare and McCarthyism. There are 4 key areas I'm going to cover in this video. We're going to start by looking at the growth of consumer culture and the causes of prosperity for American people in the 1950s. We're going to have a look at the emergence of something called the American Dream, the principle behind that, and then how people accessed that idea. We're going to have a look at 1950s pop culture and the emergence of a group of people called teenagers for the first time. And then, as I said, we're going to look at the darker side of America in the 1950s and the rise of something called McCarthyism. Let's start by looking at consumerism and the causes of prosperity then. America's economy grew after the end of World War II in 1945. If you think back to your study of America back in the 1920s, the American experience of war and the post-war era was very, very similar in World War I and in World War II. In World War I, America joined the war late. They were able to benefit by selling products to other countries, and they emerged from World War I in a very, very strong economic position. And this is much the same in World War II. Many of America's direct competitors suffered huge bomb damage, destroyed during the war, and so in the post-war era after 1945, they were focused on rebuilding. America, on the other hand, was virtually unharmed and came out of the war in a very strong position. Remember, through things like the Lend-Lease program, they'd made a lot of money as well, and some of that money kind of was being paid back to them in the immediate years after the war. So America's economy was growing after the end of World War II, and they experienced a mini boom similar to the 1920s. America continued to mass produce goods in the 1950s. We know from our study of the 20s and during the war, they were very, very good at mass production. During the 1950s, America was producing nearly half of all goods made in the world, and so their GNP, or gross national product, which is the total value of all the goods and the services they produce, doubled in the 1950s. This is a time of industrial expansion where they are making more and more goods to be sold in America and around the world. Finally then, for your average white middle-class American person, they were able to have a very comfortable lifestyle and were financially secure. We'll see in later videos that for other groups of Americans, particularly for Black Americans, they were not so able to access this comfortable lifestyle and second economic boom. But as I said, for most middle-class white Americans, they had this comfortable lifestyle that we'll explore in more detail in a minute. So there's the kind of return to consumerism, the idea that you should kind of buy and sell, and America's economic strength growing because of the war. Let's take a look at something else that really characterized the 1950s, the American dream. Put simply, the American dream was the belief that all Americans could have access to wealth and success if they worked hard. If you've seen films like The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, that's that classic story of an average American person going through times of prosperity and difficulty, but really applying themselves to become successful. And that's really the idea of the American dream. Hard work equals wealth and success for anybody. Now, in the 1950s, many wealthy white Americans moved out of these cities and into newly built suburbs, these sprawling developments around the edge of the cities. And millions of modern inventions like refrigerators, washing machines, TVs were bought by the middle class and really gave them a very comfortable lifestyle. And as we saw back in the 1920s, instead of saving up to buy these products, it was still normal to rely on hire purchase, paying for these goods in little installments over a long period of time until you then own it. In the 1950s, this consumer culture also emerged where people accepted that goods were only meant to last for a few years. And so every few years, people would be buying the latest models. And again, that helps economic growth, it helps production, it helps businesses grow further because people are renewing and rebuying goods every few years. And so, as we talked about earlier, consumer culture becomes a big part of the American identity. Shopping becomes a popular leisure activity, and consumer culture and contributing to the economic growth of America is kind of a key part to the American dream. Now, as I said, there were still many people who did not have access to this wealth, but one of the key changes in the 50s is that for people who didn't have access, they wanted to be part of the American dream. They had ambitions to be part of this American dream where they would work really hard and become successful. So there's almost this feeling in the 1950s of lots of American people all working towards the same goal of applying themselves and making a success of their lives. So we've looked at the consumerism of the time and the American dream that links in with that. For young people in America, they had some very different experiences, and we'll look at that through the lens of 1950s popular culture. After the war, young Americans had more leisure time and disposable income than previous generations. There was a feeling after the war that for the next generation of people living in peacetime, they kind of wanted something better, and their parents wanted something better for their children as well. In the 1940s, the term teenager was first used to describe young adults, and by the 1950s, this term, teenager, became associated with rebellion and individuality, and a generation of young people who had their own style and their own ideas. Now, this rebellion was reflected and manifested in the music of the time. Rock and roll became incredibly popular with young people. Much like jazz back in the 1920s, it was the music of the young generation, and the older generations were a bit skeptical or worried about it. Elvis Presley was the real icon of rock and roll music at the time, and he shocked the older generations with his dance moves, his gyrating hips, but was incredibly popular with young Americans and became a global star, a huge celebrity back in the 1950s. Now, television ownership also grew rapidly in the 1950s. In 1948, less than 1% of households had a TV, so almost no one had a television in the late 1940s. But in 10 years, by 1958, this had increased to 83.2%, with almost all American households owning a television. And much like the radio back in the 1920s and 1930s, television became dominated by adverts and encouraging people to spend and get involved in consumer culture. Things like sitcoms, soap operas, news broadcasts were very popular on television, and TV networks developed shows that aimed at and targeted children too. So there we've had the real positives of American society after World War II, the economic growth and their proper recovery after the war, the American dream and people's ambitions to become wealthy and successful, and then particularly for teenagers and young people, popular culture reflecting their individuality and their style. But as I said earlier, there was a darker side to the 1950s in America and the growth of something called McCarthyism. Let's take a look. After World War II, the USSR, communist Russia, expanded into Eastern Europe, and they then gained a really strong ally when China became communist in 1949. Now, although America and the USSR had worked together to defeat Hitler in World War II, after the war, they had no real reason to remain allies, and because they had capitalist and communist ideologies or points of view, they soon fell out. America was very concerned that communism was spreading under Stalin, and this led to the start of something called the Cold War, a period of really bad relations between capitalist America and communist Russia. And this led to what's called a second Red Scare. If you think back to our study of the 1920s, there was a fear of communism that we called the Red Scare. That comes back in a big way in the 1950s and is known by historians as the second Red Scare. Something called the House Committee of Un-American Activities was set up, or HUAC, H-U-A-C, and this was set up to investigate communist involvement in American society. People were worried that even things like the government had been infiltrated by communists, and so they started to really look at all these different people and accusing them of being communist. And this was led by a man called Senator Joe McCarthy, who started a campaign against people thought to be communists, and that became known as McCarthyism. McCarthy worked with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, who we've heard about before, to keep records of possible communists. And so in the 1950s, many people were accused, put on trial, and found guilty of being communist or having communist beliefs without any real evidence. Now, McCarthy was incredibly powerful at this time, but it all unraveled after he accused members of the US military of being communist. For many Americans, as we've talked before, Americans are quite patriotic generally as a stereotype, And they were absolutely outraged by the claims from McCarthy that their army, their military, had been infiltrated by communists. McCarthy was investigated as a result. He was shown to be a bully. He was censored by Congress and by the Senate, which basically means that they ignored him. And so by the mid-1950s, he had lost power. McCarthyism had come to an end. So there we have it, the key features of American society after World War II. The growth of consumerism and some real prosperity, particularly for white middle-class Americans. The emergence of the American dream, inspiring all different types of people to get involved in American society and to strive for economic success. And then 1950s popular culture and the rise of the teenager and teenage rebellion. We've also talked about the darker side of the 1950s, the emergence of the second Red Scare at the beginning of the Cold War. Those are the key features of American society after World War II. Thanks for watching.